Yeah, I'm going to bring in Lisa Rubin. You just pulled it up. What are we learning?
We're learning today that the court, by a 6-3 majority, Anna, has decided to stay the injunctions partially. They're saying that they will grant the government's application for stays, but only to the extent that the injunctions are broader than necessary to provide complete relief to each plaintiff withstanding to sue. And let me go back a second, zoom out for a second if I can. One of the questions here was, if the court was going to stay these injunctions, how were they going to do it? Were they going to say that each injunction could only apply in the district where it was entered? In two cases here, those districts were actually statewide, the District of New Jersey, the District of Massachusetts. But the other question was, or could you limit it to just the plaintiffs in these particular cases? Remember that 2 of these 3 cases are brought by states. So how this changes that result, what does it mean then when the individual plaintiffs who have standing to sue are states? Does that mean that we're going to get sort of a patchwork result, as one of the attorneys general, Matt Platkin of New Jersey, described to me in an interview earlier this year? Does that mean that citizenship could be conferred solely by an accident of birth? And he described to me a situation where a citizen or a resident of his state gives birth over a state line in Pennsylvania, for example. What happens if a New Jersey resident gives birth in Pennsylvania? New Jersey is a plaintiff to these cases. Pennsylvania is not. If the child to 2 undocumented immigrants is born in Pennsylvania, what is the result with respect to that person's citizenship? These are a bunch of questions that are now going to result. But at the very least, we are going to see a circumstance where the president's executive order curtailing birthright citizenship is going to effectively be allowed to be implemented in certain states, but not in others.
Okay, so Leah Littman, what does this mean for Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship? Is it now in effect in certain places, just not in the places that initially were where these cases were brought?
So unfortunately, that is going to be worked out by the lower courts on remand, because what the Republican justices decided is, as to the individual plaintiffs who filed suit, courts cannot award them nationwide injunctions. That is the only thing courts can give these individual plaintiffs, is a determination that their children would be United States citizens. But as to the states that challenge this executive order, the Supreme Court says, we are not deciding whether a nationwide injunction is necessary to provide the states with complete relief, and therefore they send the case back down to the lower courts to make that determination initially. Now, that doesn't mean the executive order is going to go into effect immediately. The executive order indicates that it contains a 30-day period in which the administration will create some sort of guidelines and process to figure out how it will be implemented. And during the oral argument, the Solicitor General said their position is that 30-day period had not started because the lower courts had enjoined the executive order before it went into effect. And so therefore, there will be at least a 30-day period before the executive order is allowed to go into effect. And again, during that period, it's likely that lower courts will be determining whether the states, in order to remedy the harms that this order causes them, can receive nationwide relief. I just want to note the Democratic appointees' strong dissents in this case. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson calls the court's decision an existential threat to the rule of law. Justice Sotomayor's dissent says no right is safe in the new legal regime the court creates. She calls the court complicit in a grave attack on our system of law. The reality is the Supreme Court's Republican justices took away lower courts' single powerful tool, the most powerful tool for reining in the Trump administration and holding them accountable to the law.
Chuck, let me get your reaction. This sounds like a giant win for the Trump administration and could likely trigger chaos now across the country.
Well, let me address the second point first, Anna. And since you have Leah and Lisa on, I'm not sure why you would ask me anything. They're both way smarter than me, but it strikes me.
You're all brilliant.
No, well, I'll prove otherwise in a moment, Anna. But it strikes me that now, individual plaintiffs in almost 100 separate federal judicial districts can seek individual relief. If a federal district court judge in Seattle can't enjoin nationwide President Trump's executive order on birthright citizenship, but can only do so in the Western District of Washington, where he sits, then similarly situated plaintiffs, women who would give birth to a child who would otherwise be a U.S. citizen, could bring suit in Maine and in Vermont and in the Northern District of Florida and everywhere in the country. And right now you have, in my view, binding Supreme Court precedent from an 1898 case that says these women would win. This is a procedural decision from the Supreme Court. It's not a substantive decision on the underlying executive order. It does strip from federal judges, Anna, a lot of power that was exercised increasingly over the last 2, 3, 4 decades against presidents of both parties. And it was clear to me from the argument that a number of the more conservative justices were going to go exactly this way, that they were opposed to this notion of a single federal judge having nationwide injunctive powers. They didn't like the notion of judge shopping, that an aggrieved plaintiff would bring a case in a district that best suited him or her. But will there be more chaos? There'll be more cases, Anna, and whether or not you think of that as chaos, I'll leave that to you. But I think more individual plaintiffs will bring more individual cases seeking similar relief.
Well, the reason I ask Chuck about the chaos is I'm trying to envision a situation in which you have to have a case, you have to bring your own case in order to get the relief, right? So if you are a person who is in this country right now in a state that wants to enforce Trump's executive order banning birthright citizenship, and you're an immigrant and you have a child, what does that mean for this child in that state compared to what it means for a child who's born in another state?
Right. So right now, arguably, children in certain states, and I think this was Lisa's point, have protections that children in other states in 30 days may not. And I take your point, Anna. It's going to require other plaintiffs to come forward and to seek injunctive relief. It doesn't mean everybody in the Northern District of Florida or in the Western District of Texas or in the Eastern District of New York has to file a lawsuit. But it does mean that lawsuits have to be filed in all of these jurisdictions because you no longer, at least according to the Supreme Court, for individual plaintiffs, have nationwide injunctive relief available to similarly situated plaintiffs, similarly situated mothers and their children. And so, yes, it invites a lot more litigation in a lot more places, and I think perhaps fairly characterized as more chaos.
I mean, even Justice Kavanaugh asked during the oral arguments, what do hospitals do with a newborn? What do states do with a newborn? Justice Gorsuch pointed at the patchwork problem that this could create. Leah, is there any resolution that is within this opinion that you're reading through?
I think this opinion is going to create additional legal questions for lower courts to answer. The big lingering question is when states can obtain these nationwide injunctions, because if they can obtain these nationwide injunctions, then that is going to minimize the kind of chaos that allowing this order to be implemented in some states rather than others would create. But we don't know whether the Supreme Court would sign off on a lower court decision that says in order to award the states complete relief, a nationwide injunction is warranted and the policy has to be blocked on a nationwide basis. I think the Democratic appointees in dissent are extremely concerned about what this new regime is going to do vis-a-vis the Trump administration. You have Justice Sotomayor in her dissent, suggesting that the Supreme Court basically rewarded the Trump administration's gamesmanship in her words. She says this court is playing along with their efforts to basically subvert the Constitution and the law by throwing out these procedural arguments that effectively allow them to implement illegal policies, policies that lower courts have determined are invalid. She faults the court for choosing this case of all cases to limit nationwide injunctions, because as we were saying, if there was any case in which nationwide relief would be warranted, you would think it would be about a case on birthright citizenship, where nationwide rules are necessary in order to prevent the kind of chaos that the individual plaintiffs and the states warned about. You know, the justices, the Democratic justices, are very concerned about the implications of this decision for the rule of law. Both Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson, in their separate writings, basically accused the court of being complicit with the degradation of the rule of law. Justice Jackson said this court's complicity in the creation of a culture of disdain for lower courts, their rulings, and the law will surely hasten the downfall of our governing institutions, because what the Republican justices are allowing the Trump administration to do is, again, implement illegal policies, potentially in places where they haven't been challenged, as to individuals who have not been able to find a lawyer to represent them to challenge the policy on their basis.